Clara Whitmore returned to her hometown on a quiet spring morning, with just one suitcase and her little daughter, Annie. The town looked almost the same as when she had left it years ago. The same cobblestone streets, the same white church steeple, the same old oak tree near the schoolyard. But something felt different now. The air seemed colder, and the smiles that once welcomed her were gone. When Clara walked down Main Street, she could feel the stares from the shop windows. The women whispered behind their hands, and the men turned away as if they didn't see her. She had expected it. She had always known coming back wouldn't be easy. But she had nowhere else to go. Years ago, Clara had been the pride of this little town. She was bright, polite, and known for her beautiful singing voice in the church choir. People would stop her on the street just to tell her how she'd go far one day. But life had taken her on a road no one had imagined. When she left, she was full of dreams. When she returned, she carried only the weight of the past and the responsibility of a child. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, near the old mill road. It was a place where no one visited, surrounded by tall grass and quiet fields. She tried to make it home for Annie, painting the walls, planting flowers in tin cans, and sewing curtains from old fabric. Annie was only 4, full of laughter and questions. To her, the world still felt kind. Clara tried to keep it that way. Every morning, Clara walked to the general store with Annie to buy bread and milk. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Doyle, barely spoke to her, though she used to be her mother's friend. When Clara turned to leave, she often heard whispers start again. Words like poor thing and fallen woman floated behind her. She pretended not to hear, but her heart felt heavy each time. Work was hard to find. No one wanted to hire her at the bakery or the school. Finally, she began sewing clothes for families in town. Clara had always been good with a needle, and though the pay was little, it kept food on the table. Sometimes she worked late into the night after Annie was asleep, her fingers sore, but her mind grateful that she could at least provide something. In those quiet hours, Clara often thought about the past, how quickly life had changed. She remembered her youth, when she used to walk by the river with her friends, laughing without fear of judgment. She had once believed that love could conquer everything, but when life turned against her, love had been the first thing to disappear. The church bells would ring every Sunday morning, and Clara could hear them from her cottage. She used to sing in that church. Her voice once filled the hall with hope. Now she never went. She didn't want to face the stares or hear the murmurs. Still, she taught Annie to pray before bed, whispering soft words of faith even when her own heart trembled with doubt. One afternoon, as she hung laundry in the backyard, an old neighbor named Mrs. Carter came by. She was one of the few who still spoke kindly. She brought a jar of jam and a small loaf of bread. "For Annie," she said with a warm smile. Clara thanked her with tears in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness. Mrs. Carter didn't ask questions or judge. She only said, "You keep going, dear." Time has a way of softening hearts. That night, Clara sat by the window while Annie slept beside her. The moonlight fell softly across the room. She looked at her daughter's face and felt a deep ache of love and guilt. She knew Annie would one day hear the same whispers she heard now. But she hoped her daughter would learn to rise above them. In the weeks that followed, Clara kept to herself. She walked quietly through the market, nodding politely to those who wouldn't meet her eyes. Children sometimes called her names behind fences, repeating words they'd heard from adults, but she never scolded them. She only smiled sadly and walked on. One evening, as she carried fabric rolls home from a client, it began to rain. The road turned muddy and she slipped, dropping everything. A wagon passed by, splashing her skirt with dirt. The man driving it didn't even slow down. She stood there for a moment, soaked and tired, then picked up the fabric with trembling hands. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears didn't solve anything. When she reached home, Annie ran to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. "Mama, I made you a picture," she said proudly, showing a drawing of them holding hands under a big sun. Clara smiled. That little piece of paper was enough to wash away the cruelty of the day. Though her world was small, Clara found moments of peace. The sound of birds in the morning, the smell of fresh bread, Annie's laughter echoing through the house. These became her treasures. She began to realize that happiness didn't always come from the world's approval. Sometimes it grew quietly from within. Still, there were nights when loneliness felt like a shadow that refused to leave. She would sit by the lamp, sewing dresses for other women, Women who would wear them to church, to dances, to gatherings where she was no longer welcome. She wondered if they ever thought about how much care she put into each stitch. Maybe they didn't, but she did it anyway, because doing her work with grace was her silent answer to all their judgment. And even though she tried to stay invisible, someone had noticed her, someone who didn't join the whispers. From across the market square, Thomas Avery, a local farmer, often saw Clara walking with her daughter. He had known her years ago, back when she used to sing at the harvest festival. He remembered her laughter and how kind she had always been to everyone. Seeing her now, carrying herself with quiet strength despite all the gossip, stirred something deep inside him. He didn't speak to her yet, but he started to look for small ways to help, buying extra eggs and leaving them at her door, or fixing the fence near her cottage without saying a word. Clara never knew who was behind those silent kindnesses, but each one made her feel a little less alone. As summer turned into autumn, the town prepared for the yearly harvest dance. Posters were hung on fences, lanterns were strung across the barn, and the air filled with excitement. For most people, it was the happiest event of the year. For Clara, it was just another reminder of where she didn't belong. She planned to spend the evening quietly at home with Annie, far from the laughter and music that would fill the night. But what Clara didn't know was that her life was about to change in a way she never expected. For years, she had lived as the woman everyone whispered about, a woman judged for her past. But soon, one man's courage and kindness would begin to break the walls that had trapped her for so long. Thomas Avery had lived in the same small town all his life. He was known as a quiet, honest man who worked hard on his farm and kept to himself. People respected him for his steady nature and kindness. After his wife Margaret passed away years earlier, Thomas had grown used to a life of silence. Days filled with chores and nights filled with the sound of the wind against the barn walls. His fields were full, his animals well cared for, but his heart often felt empty. One morning, as he delivered milk to the general store, he noticed Clara and her little girl walking along the road. The sky was still pink from sunrise and the streets were quiet. Annie skipped beside her mother, clutching a small doll. Clara looked tired, but her steps were steady. Thomas stopped for a moment, watching from a distance. Something about her calm strength touched him deeply. He remembered her from long ago. The young woman who used to sing at the harvest festivals, her voice bright and full of life. Back then, everyone admired her. She had dreams of becoming a teacher, and her laughter could fill a room. Now she walked alone, her eyes lowered, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Thomas had heard the gossip, just like everyone else. The stories people whispered about her return, the cruel names they called her, but he never believed those words. He had known too many good people who were judged unfairly. In his mind, a person's heart mattered more than their past. That evening, he couldn't stop thinking about her. As he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the hills, he thought about how unfairly she was treated. He knew how hard it was to live with loneliness. He felt it too every single day. The next week, Thomas saw Clara again at the market. She was selling some hand-sewn aprons, hoping to earn a little extra money. Her hands were red from sewing, and the smile she gave customers was small but polite. A few people bought from her, though most just walked past without a word. When she packed up her things to leave, Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, tipping his hat. Clara turned in surprise. "Mr. Avery," she replied, her voice quiet but kind. "I just wanted to say your work is fine," he said, picking up one of the aprons. "You have a real gift with a needle." Her face brightened slightly. "Thank you," she said, though her tone was shy, as if she wasn't used to hearing kind words anymore. He handed her a few coins and smiled. "I'll take this one. My sister could use it." When she tried to offer change, he shook his head. "No, it's worth every penny." Then he wished her a good day and walked away. It was a small exchange, but for Clara, it meant more than he could know. It had been a long time since someone spoke to her with simple respect. In the days that followed, Thomas found quiet ways to help her. When he brought milk to the store, he'd leave a small basket of apples near her doorstep. On cold evenings, he'd drop off some extra firewood without saying a word. He never wanted her to feel pity, only care. He knew pride mattered to people who had lost much. Clara noticed these small acts of kindness but didn't know who to thank. She only prayed for the person who was thoughtful enough to help her. Each small gesture made her believe that maybe not everyone in the town had turned away. One afternoon, Annie ran to her mother holding a bright red apple. "Mama, look! Someone left this at the gate," she said happily. Clara smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. "Maybe it's just a kind neighbor," she said softly, though she secretly wondered who could be behind it. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his life as usual, working his fields and feeding his animals. But something had changed in him. For the first time in years, he looked forward to walking through town. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of Clara at the tailor's shop or the post office, and he'd feel a quiet warmth in his chest. It wasn't just sympathy, and it was admiration. He saw in her a strength that most people couldn't. The townsfolk noticed that Thomas never joined in their gossip. When others spoke ill of Clara, he stayed silent. Once, at the local feed store, a man made an unkind remark about her. Thomas looked up from his work and said in his calm, firm voice, "If you can't speak kindly about someone, best not speak at all." After that, no one dared bring up her name around him again. The days passed, and autumn slowly painted the town in shades of gold and orange. The harvest season was near, and people were busy preparing for the big celebration, the harvest dance. It was the most awaited night of the year, filled with laughter, music, and warm pies. For most, it was a night of joy. For Clara, it was another reminder of her distance from the rest of the town. One Sunday morning, Thomas saw her leaving the church after service. She had stood at the very back holding Annie's hand, ready to leave before anyone could approach her. The sunlight touched her face as she stepped outside, and Thomas felt a quiet resolve stir within him. He didn't know what made him do it, but his heart told him that she shouldn't face the world alone anymore. He walked up to her. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently. She looked startled but managed a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Avery?" "Good morning," he replied. There was a short pause, and then he said, "The harvest dance is next week. I was wondering, would you allow me the honor of your company that evening?" The words hung in the air. The people nearby stopped talking. The silence was heavy. Clara's cheeks turned pink. She looked down, embarrassed. "Mr. Avery, I don't think that would be wise," she said softly. "People might talk." Thomas gave a small smile. "They already do," he said kindly. "Let them." "I'd still like to ask." Clara's heart raced. No one had ever stood up for her like that. But fear held her back. She shook her head gently. "Thank you, truly, but I can't," she whispered, and hurried away with Annie before anyone could say more. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of Thomas's words echoed in her mind. Let them talk. There had been no pity in his voice, only quiet courage. The next morning, when she went to fetch water, she found a small folded note near her doorstep. It was written in simple handwriting. No one should face the world alone. A. Clara stood there for a long time, reading the note again and again. Her hands trembled slightly. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost. Hope. She placed the note in her sewing box, close to her heart. The harvest dance was still days away, and she didn't know if she would have the courage to go. But one thing had changed. For the first time since her return, she didn't feel invisible. Someone saw her not for her past, but for who she was. A woman who had endured much yet still stood with quiet grace. And somewhere in her heart, a small light began to shine again. The week of the harvest dance arrived with the scent of ripe apples in the air, and the sound of laughter echoing through town. Everywhere people were busy, hanging lanterns, baking pies, and polishing boots for the grand evening. The red barn at the edge of town, where the dance would take place, was being decorated with strings of lights and golden leaves. It was the event that everyone looked forward to all year, but not Clara. She watched the town prepare from a distance, her heart caught between fear and longing. She had always loved the harvest dance when she was young. Back then, she would sing on stage as couples danced, her voice filling the night. The barn would glow with warmth and joy, and she'd feel like she belonged. Now she couldn't imagine walking into that same barn, knowing that people still whispered behind her back. Still, Thomas's words and the little note he left kept echoing in her mind. No one should face the world alone. She had folded that note and kept it safely inside her sewing box, beside her needles and threads. Every night, when she worked on her sewing, her eyes would fall on it. It gave her courage, though she didn't fully understand why. One evening, as she was mending a customer's dress, her daughter Annie asked, "Mama, will we go to the dance?" Clara smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. That's for the town people." "But we live in the town," Annie said innocently, "and Mr. Avery said it's for everyone." Clara paused for a long moment, her hands frozen over the fabric. She didn't want to tell Annie that not everyone wanted them there. So she simply said, "Maybe someday." Later that night, she stepped outside onto the small porch. The stars twinkled brightly above and the sound of crickets filled the air. She could see the faint lights of the town in the distance. Somewhere out there, Thomas was probably finishing his work on the farm, maybe also looking at the same sky. For years, Clara had lived quietly, letting people's opinions shape her world. But something in her was beginning to change. Maybe it was Thomas's kindness, or maybe it was the thought of showing Annie that bravery mattered more than fear. Either way, a gentle voice inside her whispered that it might be time to stop hiding. The day before the dance, Thomas came by her cottage, pretending to deliver a sack of grain to her neighbor. When he saw her in the garden, he greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Avery," she replied softly. She tried to act calm, but her heart beat faster. He hesitated, then said, "I didn't mean to trouble you the other day with my invitation." "It wasn't any trouble," Clara said quickly. "It was very kind of you." "I meant what I said," Thomas continued. "People talk, yes, but they always will. You've done nothing wrong. You've worked hard and held your head high. That's more than most." Clara looked down at her hands, unsure how to answer. "It's not easy being the talk of the town," she admitted. "No," Thomas said gently. "But sometimes the only way to quiet a rumor is to walk right through it." She looked up at him, surprised by his words. There was something so calm and sincere in his tone that she couldn't find a reason to argue. He smiled kindly. "The dance is tomorrow night. I'll be there waiting. If you decide to come, I'll be honored. If not, I'll still be glad we spoke." Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara standing by the garden fence with her thoughts swirling. That evening, Clara sat by the lamp sewing a new dress for Annie. The little girl hummed a song, completely unaware of her mother's inner struggle. Clara had a piece of soft blue fabric left over from a client's order. She looked at it for a while, then decided to make herself a simple dress, something neat and plain, but lovely in its quiet way. As she worked, she thought about how much her life had changed since her return. For years she had felt invisible. Now someone had looked at her and seen more than her past. That feeling alone gave her courage. The next evening arrived quickly. The sky was painted with colors of gold and pink as the sun began to set. Music drifted from the barn across the fields, fiddles, laughter, and the soft rhythm of dancing feet. Clara stood before the mirror in her small room, her blue dress neatly pressed, her hair tied back with a ribbon. Annie clapped her hands in delight. "Mama, you look so pretty," she said. Clara smiled nervously. "Do I really?" "Yes. You look like the ladies in the storybooks." Clara's heart warmed at her daughter's words. She knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Thank you, my love," she whispered. Then she took a deep breath and stepped outside. The cool night air brushed her face. She walked slowly toward the barn, each step filled with both fear and strength. When she reached the edge of town, people began to notice her. The chatter softened and eyes turned her way. Some whispered, others just stared. But Clara kept walking, holding her head high. Her heart pounded, but she refused to turn back. At the barn entrance, Thomas stood waiting just as he had promised. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile so warm that it eased all her fears. He offered his hand without hesitation. "Evening, Miss Whitmore," he said softly. "You came." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I'm glad you did," he said simply. Together they walked inside. The band continued playing, but people watched in quiet surprise. Clara could feel their eyes on her, but she focused only on the music and Thomas's kind presence beside her. When the next song began, Thomas turned to her. "May I have this dance?" Her breath caught for a moment. It had been years since anyone had asked her to dance. "I don't know if I remember how," she said shyly. "Then we'll remember together," he replied. He held her hand gently, and they began to move across the floor. At first, she was stiff with nervousness, afraid of making a mistake. But Thomas's calm movements and the soft music helped her relax. Slowly she began to smile. Then she laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. The people around them watched in silence. Some were shocked, others simply curious. But gradually, as the song continued, something changed. The whispers faded. The atmosphere softened. Thomas didn't care what anyone thought. He only saw the woman before him, graceful, kind, and strong despite all she had faced. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt seen. When the song ended, a few people even clapped politely. Someone offered her a cup of cider, and another complimented her dress. Clara was too surprised to speak. For the rest of the night, she sat with Thomas near the lanterns, talking quietly while Annie played nearby with other children. The music carried through the air and laughter surrounded them. As the night went on, Clara realized that something powerful had happened. She hadn't just danced. She had faced the very people who once turned their backs on her, and she had done it with grace. When the last song ended and the lanterns began to dim, Thomas walked her home. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was peaceful. When they reached her cottage, he looked at her with gentle eyes and said, "You did brave tonight." Clara smiled softly. "I had help," she whispered. As he left, she stood at the door, the night breeze brushing her hair, the stars bright above her. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel so small. Something inside her had shifted. That night, she placed the blue dress neatly on the chair and whispered a quiet thank you to the one man who saw her not for her past, but for her heart. After the harvest dance, Clara's life seemed to change in ways she hadn't expected. The memory of that evening stayed with her, like a soft glow that followed her everywhere. The sound of music, the warmth of lanterns, and Thomas's gentle hand guiding her across the floor replayed in her mind whenever she felt afraid or lonely. For the first time since her return to town, she began to believe that maybe people could see her differently, that maybe kindness could replace judgment. The morning after the dance, Annie woke up bright and cheerful. "Mama, did you hear? Some of the ladies at the market said you looked so happy last night," she exclaimed, hugging her tightly. Clara smiled but kept her eyes down. It was strange hearing people speak kindly about her. She had almost forgotten how it felt to be seen for who she truly was. Clara spent that day sewing, but her thoughts kept returning to Thomas. She couldn't stop thinking about how he had treated her with respect, without pity or judgment. Unlike the townsfolk who only saw her past, he had looked at her present, at her strength, her care for her daughter, and her quiet dignity. That thought alone gave her courage. Thomas, on his side, continued his quiet acts of kindness. Every morning he checked on her little garden, making sure it had enough water. He left a basket of fresh eggs at her doorstep, and sometimes even carried a bag of groceries from the market without saying a word. Clara never knew how to thank him. She only smiled quietly to herself, a warmth in her chest that grew stronger with each passing day. Over the next few weeks, their paths began to cross more often. Sometimes it was at the general store, where Thomas would offer a polite nod or a few friendly words. Sometimes it was in the fields, where Annie ran to greet him with a cheerful wave. Gradually, Clara realized that she was no longer walking through town alone. Even if others still whispered, there was now one person who saw her heart. One crisp autumn afternoon, Thomas invited Clara and Annie to visit his farm. She hesitated at first, worried about being seen, but Annie's excitement convinced her. "Please, Mama. He has chickens and a big pond. Can we go?" she begged. Clara smiled, realizing that sharing small moments like this was part of building courage. The farm was beautiful. Thomas's field stretched wide, and the golden leaves of the trees sparkled in the afternoon sun. Annie ran ahead, chasing butterflies, while Clara followed slowly, enjoying the peaceful quiet. Thomas greeted them with his warm smile and showed them around, pointing out his animals and letting Annie help feed the chickens. Clara watched her daughter laugh freely, and a deep sense of relief filled her heart. For once, she didn't feel judged or unwanted. She felt like she belonged. Thomas and Clara spent time talking quietly, walking along the fence line while Annie explored nearby. They spoke about simple things at first: the weather, the crops, the best ways to plant vegetables in the spring. But gradually, their conversations became more personal. Thomas shared stories of his youth, of how he had loved and lost, and how he had learned that life was often unfair but could also be beautiful, if one looked carefully. Clara listened, sharing small details of her own life. She spoke about the years she had spent away, the challenges she had faced, and the joys of raising Annie. She didn't tell everything, but she allowed herself to be seen in small, honest ways. Thomas listened without interruption, his eyes kind and patient. She realized that he never judged her or offered pity. Instead, he treated her as an equal, a person worthy of respect and care. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Thomas suggested they sit by the pond. Clara watched as Annie skipped stones across the water, her laughter echoing softly. Thomas handed Clara a blanket and sat beside her, leaving enough space to be comfortable but close enough to share the moment. For a long while, they simply watched the sun sink below the hills, listening to the gentle ripple of water and the rustling of leaves. Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The town's whispers, the stares, the judgment, all of it seemed far away. In this quiet moment, she felt safe, seen and valued. "I'm glad you came today," Thomas said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara looked at him, unsure how to respond. "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "You made the right choice," he said firmly. "It's not easy to face the world when it has been unkind. But you did, and that shows courage." Clara felt a lump in her throat. For so long she had carried shame and fear. But Thomas's words were different. They didn't carry judgment or pity. They carried truth. She nodded silently, feeling a quiet strength growing inside her. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Clara spent more time together. They walked along the river, shared quiet meals, and sometimes worked side by side in his garden. Annie adored Thomas, following him everywhere and learning small things from him. How to plant seeds, feed the animals, and appreciate the beauty of simple moments. The town began to notice the change. People who had once whispered about Clara now saw her with Thomas smiling and laughing, and some of them began to speak differently. Slowly, the harsh judgment that had once surrounded her began to fade, replaced by curiosity and respect. While not everyone had changed, Clara realized she no longer needed everyone's approval. She only needed the approval of those who truly mattered: herself, her daughter, and the man who had seen her heart. One chilly evening, as autumn's first frost settled over the fields, Thomas walked Clara and Annie home. The moonlight reflected off the rooftops, casting a silver glow over the streets. They paused at Clara's gate, lingering in the quiet night. "Clara," Thomas said softly, "you've shown me something I didn't know I needed to see. Courage and kindness in a world that can be harsh." "I am grateful for that." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "And you've shown me that it's possible to be seen for who I am. Not what people say about me," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions stirring inside her. Thomas smiled gently, reaching out to brush a stray hair from her face. "You deserve to be seen," he said simply, "and I hope to keep seeing you for a long time." Clara felt a flutter of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She knew that life would never be perfect and that some judgment might linger, but she also knew something more important, that love and kindness could transform even the darkest moments. As she watched Thomas walk back down the lane, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her heart. She was no longer the woman the town had shunned. She was a mother, a friend, and a woman of quiet strength, and most importantly, she had found someone who saw her not for her past, but for the person she had always been inside. That night, she tucked Annie into bed and whispered a soft prayer of gratitude. She thought about the harvest dance, the walks with Thomas, and the gentle moments of understanding that had slowly begun to reshape her life. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt ready to face the future, not with fear but with hope, courage, and the knowledge that her heart had finally been seen. The days that followed were filled with simple joys: autumn leaves in the wind, laughter at the market, and quiet evenings spent with Thomas and Annie. Clara realized that life could still be beautiful, even after hardship. She had learned that true strength was not in hiding from the world, but in standing tall, facing it with dignity, and embracing the kindness that sometimes came when least expected. And in the midst of it all, she understood something deeply important: that happiness wasn't about avoiding the past, nor was it about the opinions of others. It was about moments of connection, acts of courage, and the gentle assurance that someone, just one person, could truly see your heart. The weeks after the harvest dance brought a quiet change to Clara's life. She no longer felt the heavy weight of whispers that once followed her. Even if some townspeople still looked at her sideways, their words no longer mattered as much. Her world had grown in ways she never imagined. Thomas Avery, with his steady kindness, had become a constant presence, a reminder that someone could see the truth of her heart. Every morning, Clara would wake to Annie's laughter, and for the first time, she felt that her life was full of small, bright moments rather than just struggle and solitude. Thomas would often come by, helping with chores or bringing fresh milk and eggs. Sometimes they worked side by side in the garden, planting seeds and watching the soil carefully, knowing that with care, it would yield life and growth. Those simple hours brought Clara peace. One crisp autumn morning, Thomas invited Clara and Annie to his farmhouse for breakfast. Clara hesitated, as always, worried about how the townspeople might view it. But Annie's excitement was impossible to resist. "Mama, please. We can't stay home all the time," she pleaded. Clara smiled and agreed, realizing that embracing small joys was part of courage. The farmhouse was warm, with sunlight streaming through the windows, dust motes floating in the golden light. Thomas had prepared pancakes, fresh fruit, and honey from his own bees. Annie ate quickly, chattering nonstop about the chickens and the big pond, while Clara watched with a quiet smile. She realized how much these small, ordinary moments meant, a reminder that life's beauty often came in simplicity. As they finished breakfast, Thomas suggested a walk along the edge of his fields. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of hay and earth. Clara and Thomas walked together, Annie skipping ahead, picking up leaves and showing them proudly. They spoke about small things at first, the changing colors of the leaves, the harvest coming in, the plans for winter. But gradually the conversation became more personal. Thomas shared stories of his youth, the hard work he had done, the challenges he had faced after losing his wife. Clara listened, finding comfort in his openness. She realized how rare it was to meet someone who could speak so honestly about life's hardships, while still seeing beauty in the world. Clara, in turn, shared bits of her past she had never told anyone, the difficulties of raising Annie alone, the fear of judgment, the nights she had spent wondering if life would ever bring happiness again. Thomas listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. His calm presence allowed her to speak freely, and for the first time in years, Clara felt completely understood. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas took her hand gently. "Clara," he said softly, "I've seen your courage, your kindness, your strength. I see you for who you truly are, and I would be honored if we could walk through life together, supporting each other along the way." Clara felt a rush of emotions, surprise, joy, relief, and a deep, quiet happiness. She had never expected this, yet it felt natural. She looked at Thomas, then at Annie, and realized that for the first time the idea of a future didn't scare her. Instead, it felt full of promise. I would like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with certainty. Thomas smiled warmly, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. "Then we will face it together," he said simply. The following weeks were filled with gentle changes. Clara and Thomas spent more time together, walking, talking, and planning small projects on the farm. Annie thrived in this environment of kindness and care, learning to plant seeds, feed animals, and enjoy the beauty of simple moments. She adored Thomas, seeing him as both a friend and a guide, and Clara watched them with a full heart. Word of their growing friendship began to reach the town. People who had once whispered about Clara now spoke differently, noticing her calm happiness and the respect Thomas showed her. Slowly, judgment softened, replaced by curiosity and admiration. The town was learning a quiet lesson, that one person's kindness could change how others saw the world. As winter approached, the farm and Clara's small cottage were filled with warmth. Clara learned to cook with Thomas, sharing laughter and stories over the stove. They worked together side by side, planting, tending, and caring for the small animals that were now part of their shared life. Every day, Clara felt her confidence grow. She was no longer the woman who walked alone through the streets filled with fear and doubt. She was a mother, a friend, and a woman whose heart had been seen and valued. One snowy evening, Thomas invited Clara and Annie to the farmhouse for a special dinner. The house was cozy, the fire crackling in the hearth. Thomas had prepared a warm meal and the table was set with care. Annie was overjoyed. helping set plates and placing napkins just so. Clara felt a deep sense of belonging she had never experienced before. After dinner, Thomas led Clara to the porch where the night sky stretched wide and clear, stars twinkling brightly. "Clara," he said, "I want you to know that my care for you is real. I've seen your heart, your strength, your kindness, and I want to spend my life by your side, sharing the joys and challenges of each day." Clara looked at him, tears of happiness forming in her eyes. "Thomas, I've waited so long for someone to see me for who I am, and now I finally feel it. I would be honored to walk through life with you." From that moment, Clara's life was transformed. She and Thomas became a steady presence in each other's lives, supporting one another through both joy and difficulty. Annie thrived, surrounded by love, learning important lessons about kindness, courage, and the strength of family. The townspeople began to see Clara differently. Though some remained skeptical, many noticed the quiet dignity and happiness she carried. They watched as Thomas treated her with respect and care, realizing that the woman they had once judged harshly was a person of grace and strength. Years later, people would remember the night of the harvest dance not as a scandalous event, but as a turning point, the night the town began to see Clara in a new light. They remembered her courage to face judgment and the way Thomas's kindness had opened the door to her happiness. Clara often thought about her life before returning to the town, the fear, loneliness, and judgment she had endured. She realized that those hardships had shaped her, but they did not define her. What mattered most was the love and understanding she had found, the connections she had nurtured, and the courage she had discovered within herself. One evening, sitting by the fire with Thomas and Annie, Clara reflected on her journey. She felt a deep gratitude for the small acts of kindness that had helped her endure, for the courage it took to face the world despite fear, and for the love that had finally found her. Her heart was full, and she knew that her life, once overshadowed by whispers and judgment, had become a story of hope, courage, and lasting joy. Clara understood that life was not about perfection nor about erasing the past. It was about embracing the present, cherishing the people who truly mattered, and allowing love and kindness to guide the way. And in that understanding, she found freedom. Freedom from fear, from judgment, and from the loneliness that had once weighed so heavily on her heart. With Thomas by her side and Annie's laughter filling their home, Clara finally felt the peace she had longed for. She knew that no matter what the future held, she had discovered something priceless. The power of a heart truly seen, the courage to face the world, and the beauty of a life filled with love. And so, Clara's story, once filled with whispers and judgment, became a tale of hope, resilience, and the quiet strength of a woman whose heart was finally recognized. She had endured the hardest seasons of life, and in the end she had found joy, belonging, and a love that would last a lifetime.